All right. Oh, start record. Let's try it again. Now it's recorded. All right. Well, I do want to respect your time and the time of anybody who, is going to be watching this.
Right.
So, maybe not more than an hour, depending on how much we find to talk about.
Sure.
Is that
Sure.
okay? Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. I'm going to play this for the group membership and everything, and
Hmm.
the group, of course, being Ozark Rail and Bus Transit Society. Um, I'm thinking though of starting another group for statewide rail. I posted on some other Facebook groups and mentioned statewide rail, and people actually kind of excited around the state. They would like that. They like that idea.
I know that I've seen it floated by a couple of other people. One on Twitter whose name escapes me, but it was another one who was involved in state politics. It was citing it. Um, and I know just on a personal level that I think that investing more heavily in decent rail and high capacity systems across the state would be better economically and environmentally than the constantly expanding on the highway system.
Yeah.
Well, kind of like what I posted in the group the other day. We'd look at lower fatalities, better infrastructure buildup. It was actually something, if you don't mind me kind of jumping the gun on it, my wife and I, ironically enough, were discussing it a day or two before you contacted me. Um, because we've been big on green energy initiatives and stuff like that, just on a personal note. And around together was, how do you start this? How do you at least proof of concept it to get people on board? And I'm like, well, at the small scale, you could start with systemically phasing out the diesel buses and switch over to electric. And of course, we've got the trolley system down here in Little Rock. But you start at the small scale, get the municipalities going on with electric vehicles on the mass transit systems, and then of course we've got with the federal level, with Secretary Buttigieg pushing on the rail systems and clean energy initiatives. If we go ahead and get going on that, we stand a good chance of getting ahead of it. And instead of being a flyover state, which is how we're generally considered, we become a central hub of transport and commerce across country. So it would really be a boon economically, not just in the sense of building up the infrastructure, but also offering more opportunities for tourism, protecting the environment. It seems like a no-brainer. Um, and the one thing I would want to take into consideration is, of course, given our location and everything else, I want to work with the U.S. Geologic Survey to make sure that seismically that we're not active enough for it to be a threat, anything like that, especially with the recent fracking and stuff like that. We need to make sure that if we're setting a rail system down, that it can endure whatever type of seismic activity we're subject to. But I know that because of how the tectonic plates are on this side of the Rockies, it's not as volatile as over on the West Coast. So not as much to worry about.
Well, actually, in the eastern part of the state, there is a big tectonic plate.
Okay.
And when I first went to school in Jonesboro at Arkansas State University
Mhm.
back in the mid 70s, which boy, it's a long time ago. But anyway, uh, we uh, we had a big earthquake, and it created cracks in the dormitory I was in.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And apparently, in history, back in the 1830s, there was a big enough earthquake that the Mississippi ran backwards for a period of time.
Remember hearing about that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we do have a big one there. The good news is, uh, the high-speed trains, for whatever reason, are popular in countries with lots of mountains, and Japan has a lot of earthquakes.
Right.
And they've only had two accidents with the Japanese bullet train. One was due to an earthquake. It shook the tracks and the train jumped. No
Right.
fatalities. And the Japanese are working on anti-earthquake technology. So
I genuinely have wondered. I know that I know I can remember from TV shows back in the 70s when they were working on earthquake proof designs for bricks, things that would hold together. I
Yeah,
was wondering if there'd be some way to put in the structure underneath where it is shock dampening so that if there is activity, it doesn't necessarily translate the vibrations into the carriages and everything else. So that's, like I said, it's one of those where obviously it does exist in other, developed countries, but it's wanting to make sure that we've got everything safe and all.
sure.
So yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Um,
And you would expect the Japanese to develop something like that. Of course, they're going to do it.
right. Um, no, like I said, I was very happy when I heard from you because it had been something that, like I said, we were just discussing here at the house ahead of time, kind of on the heels of my announcing the campaign and just discussing, with environment being a big part of the platform. Well,
Right.
this is something that would be a benefit.
Well, I think it would be environmentally. One of the things I found out is that there's a lot of green technology for trains. I mean, there is for cars. So in Germany, they've developed just a very few years ago. It's just now coming on the rail lines, battery electric passenger trains,
Okay.
and they can go about 60 miles or 100 kilometers before they need to be recharged.
Mhm.
And because so much of Germany's railroad track is not electrified, they don't have the overhead lines or anything in the bed or anything.
Sure.
But they're coming up with all kinds of plans for how to recharge the batteries and everything. Uh, they have oh, I forget what they call it, but anyway, it's like an accordion thing. It comes up and it connects with the overhead lines when you pull into a station, and it will recharge the batteries. And they've designed the batteries are huge.
Right.
They can recharge them in about 10 minutes. So that's enough to let passengers alight, clean the train, and board the new ones, and then you're
Hmm.
ready to go again.
Yeah. No, if you stagger them logistically to where you've got reasonable stops and exchange points, that'd be 100% doable. Um,
But then the other thing they're working on, and that it's going to be coming online very soon, is hydrogen fuel cell powered trains, and they can go about 500 or 600 miles before
right.
you have to refuel it. And so that is very promising. And so I'm just letting you know, I do all this research, and if you ever have any questions, you can ask us, because I've just really looked at this. And when I first started the group about 3 years ago, I was just kind of geeking out over the trains because I love cars and I love aviation, and but people that love those things tend to love watches. They tend to love trains too.
Right. Yeah.
So I was just really geeking out. These people here in Northwest Arkansas said, well, Richard, there's some other things that are important too. We had to talk about getting a regional transit authority, which I knew we would need. So
Sure.
that's one of our big thrusts right now. But to get back with this, so keeping in mind, we want to build this out. I was looking at the Texas Central Railroad,
Mhm.
and there are different ways to do this. Of course, we could keep all the passenger rail service uh, in the public domain. The
Right.
state owns it.
Yep.
Or what they're trying to do in Central Texas, though, is they're trying to make this a completely private company that have investors, and so now they want to build this rail system, and they're going to use the Japanese bullet train. I don't know if you've heard about it, but anyway,
I'm somewhat familiar. I wasn't not didn't know that Texas was borrowing the plans precisely, but I know of the Japanese bullet train at least. So.
yeah. So the Texas wants to build it between Dallas and Houston, with one stop in College Station.
Okay.
And their plan right now is for it to do like 186 miles an hour. And so you could go between the two cities in about an hour and a half.
Right.
The problem they're running into, there are problems with both, I guess. One is in Arkansas, realistically, keeping the passenger rail service in the as a public domain kind of thing might be really hard because it's a lot of lingering conservative ideas, which I'm not putting down at all, but
No, they've got their place, but we got
Yeah.
to balance them. Yeah.
yeah, but people will say, well, no, don't let the government do it. Let's have a private outfit do it.
Right.
But then in Texas, what they're finding, since they want to do this high speed, you have to build dedicated track.
Mhm.
And even though they're really selling the economic benefits hard, I mean, they're building 200 and almost 50 miles of dedicated track, and they're talking about the numbers of people who are going to be employed and everything. We'll get back to that.
Sure.
People are still opposed to it pretty much because they're going to have to buy up a lot of land, and especially land from private farmers and ranchers. And since
Yeah.
it's not the state or the federal government, they're saying they can't use eminent domain to just come in and claim the land if somebody doesn't want to make a deal with them.
Sure.
So just want to bring that issue up and just get your general thoughts on it. How do you see us working around this if maybe people are going to be opposed to making this completely a state venture, but then we can't, if we try to build a dedicated high-speed rail, what's going to happen with a private group that wants to do it?
Well, I think what you run into at that point is you're going to have to balance it out, which is what we see with most stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
we could move forward with it as a public initiative as far as establishing and laying out and acquiring the land and everything else. And then as far as the privatization, you can hire the private companies for the contract work, make sure it's up to standard, up to code. Everybody has to work under the rules, that kind of stuff. But leaving the operation of it, that seems more like it would still need to be a state type of a deal.
Right.
So I could see private influence as far as in the implementation, the upkeep, the that kind. But in the operation and the maintenance and the oversight, that needing to remain in the public domain and in the public interest, because you are dealing with safety concerns. And I knew the land thing would be a consideration. That's just always going to be a fact. So yeah, that's where I think it would have to be a blend and be very careful about how we would move forward. Certainly there are opportunities for private companies to invest and build and work with us to put something like this in place, but not in the sense of giving them ownership over it. It is still by the state, for the state, ideally, like we said, eventually joining in with federal, much like the interstate highway systems and everything else. But I think that's kind of how we have to view it. This is simply it's transporting people and goods and whatever back and forth, primarily people in this particular case, but it's functionally no different than a highway system at that point. And whether it gets privatized in the future or something like that, I mean, we can look back now at historically when the first railroads built, it was massive initiatives getting it done, and then eventually you ended up with Amtrak and different companies that were using what got put in from the infrastructure. But at least on the front end, I would think we'd have to make sure that it is public domain controlled and in the interest and being provided for by that.
Okay.
And then having that kind of oversight.
Yeah, what you seem to be talking about is a private public project or program where
Essentially.
you combine the two so that we can show where people are going to care for whatever reason that corporations are going to make their money. But I to get to a different component of this, as I look at the tracks that we have in the railroad map that we have now, I see three big routes that we might want to consider covering. One is from Northwest Arkansas to Little Rock, and from Little Rock to Memphis.
Sure.
And then historically, on the western side of the state, we had a train called the Arkansas Express.
Mhm.
And I believe it did start up in Kansas City and came down to somewhere. And I don't know if it was Fort Smith or where, but right now you would pretty much start in Fort Smith.
Okay.
And you could go almost straight up to Kansas City with a passenger train. Then the other one is Little Rock to Dallas.
Yep.
And, that would possibly be the most populous route because Dallas is a big center. The issue there is, I mean, there are a lot of advantages, but for one, you mentioned carrying things. Well, in high-speed trains around the world, and I'm not just telling you, this is for the group too, so that they don't
totally.
know.
Yeah.
They carry what's called light freight, which is basically packages from, say, I don't know, Walmart.com. So you might want to emphasize that. So,
Right.
but also another way to create density and create the reason why people would travel this way is to maybe have a rail station in the airports,
Mhm.
like the Dallas Fort Worth International Airport, the Clinton Airport in Little Rock, XNA here in Northwest Arkansas, and so on.
Right.
And if you did that, then you have a multimodal form of transportation open to people.
Oh, absolutely.
But,
And go ahead. Go ahead.
well, no, you go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, again, with part of this being just you have done more research on the rail than I have. So me and my dad, one of our favorite things is we hate moving empty space. Like if you're moving houses or something, you pack the drawers in the dresser full and move it as is. Don't move something empty. So I'm glad to know that there are accommodations in light rail, because I couldn't imagine moving, the industrial, like having a dedicated carriage for just one wind turbine blade or something like that. But I'm glad to know that there are mechanisms in place for logistics for moving small goods like that. That's beautiful, because that makes it more viable.
Yeah, that would be part of the rationale for high-speed passenger rail, because
Right.
you're going to have a car that's just for mail and packages, things like that.
What I was going to add on to with the Dallas one was I was immediately thinking that aiming one towards New Orleans, where we've got access direct to and from things coming in from the port at that point, you now also have more commerce going back and forth.
Yeah.
There's multiple different good centers. We're geographically ideal for a lot of that. So
we are. And another thing, and we have a member of the group from Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, from Fort Smith, you could easily strike out and get to Oklahoma City with passenger rail.
Sure.
The issue here, and once again, it's for the members, and many of them don't know, when Amtrak was started, the railroads were glad to get rid of the passenger service because for whatever reasons in the 50s and 60s, we agreed we would have highways and not railroads.
Right.
And what has happened since that time is that the freight haulers have seen that railroads are simply just more efficient energy-wise and lower cost than putting everything on a big tractor trailer rig and hauling it down the highway. That is actually an extremely expensive way to move anything, including people. So when they got rid of the passenger rail side, though, in 1971, they agreed to let Amtrak trains come through unimpeded, which they have never honored that. And I used to take Amtrak from Austin, Texas to go see my brother in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an 8 to 10 hour trip. Now, thank goodness, I'm not kidding. Thank goodness, Amtrak has a lot of room in the seats. There's a lot of knee room. The seats are very comfortable, very well cushioned. Your wide seat, so much better than a bus or even a cheap airline.
Right.
So they kind of the big windup. And now here's my question to you as governor.
Hopeful.
What? Yeah, no, you're going to win. We're going to be positive.
All right.
So as governor, what do you think you can do, or what do you see you being able to do to make sure the freight lines open up and make space for these high speed trains? It doesn't do any good to have a train that can do 125 miles an hour if you have to pull over and let a pokey 10-mile-an-hour freight train go by while you wait, you know.
Right.
So you want to
Um,
be able to get right from Little Rock, because I figure you could do it in about 3.5 hours from Little Rock to Dallas. And that's faster than you could drive. And the tickets may not cost much more than what you would spend in gas.
no, they wouldn't have to at all. And of course, once you're there, once you've made that trip, you're then connected to the Dallas DART system and can get around really easily from down
Well, you
there.
can get
to-
on the Texas high speed rail, or you
Yeah.
can get on a plane, or,
yeah.
you know, go hang out
Um,
and do stuff. So,
Yeah. One of the ways, and this is one of the, it touches on a lot of the other stuff I'm hoping to do, when in office, is trying to work with the legislation and address the budget in how we're giving breaks and things like that to corporations. I think that incentivizing it for corporations to utilize the high speed rail or the rail system, period, for moving freight, rather than using the highway system, could be used to our advantage. Um, in particular, when you look at, like you're talking about, the overhead cost on everything, sure, you'll get pushback from Teamsters and things like that because we're going to lose trucking jobs, all that kind of stuff. But in a bottom line financial and human sense, you're also looking at um, lower chances of fatality, lower risk of insurance on the road, lower cost of upkeep. There's just a bottom line return on investment improvement,
right.
both fiscally and from a humanitarian and ecological standpoint. You're not putting people at risk. You don't have truck drivers that are putting themselves on the line trying to haul and cheating the log books and trying to go further than they should. I mean, which is admirable. It's a good work ethic being put to a bad use, but when you've incentivized pushing yourself like that for people, that's what you end up with. So I think that, renegotiating things so that we actually put practices in place that encourage, not coerce, but encourage corporations and companies to rethink how they're moving and handling their logistics in, using what we've got and using rail systems and things like that, rather than relying on, which then also reduces the congestion on the highways on your rush hour and everything else. It's a multifaceted kind of win. And then if we do look at the right of way and all that, well, if we're dealing with high speed rail and putting them in, then like you said, you don't have the pokey train that's going by and all that. Which is, again, funny that you mentioned. My grandfather was actually a mechanical engineer, and
Oh,
yeah, trains weren't his specific thing, but it was always fascinating because he had studied it all to the point, just kind of as a hobby. He lived down in Louisville, and so the train line right there that runs alongside Highway 82, coming between Texarkana and shooting across the state, he'd get stuck at that all the time, and he would count how many engines they had on the front end of it, and could tell you to within a couple of car accuracy exactly how many cars it was going to be. You'd count, and he had it. That's no problem. But yeah, I think there are a lot of people in those smaller towns and smaller communities that do run into that kind of issue where you're trying to get from point A to point B. There's only one road in town, and if it's sucked up by a train for an hour, you're just stuck. That's it. So reinvesting and putting in the higher speed would benefit everyone mutually in every single direction.
well, there's so much that could be done, and I'm glad you mentioned courage, because if you make this rewarding, it's easier to attract flies with honey than with vinegar.
Sure.
And so if we make it rewarding for them to cooperate and to work with us, it will certainly work. I mean, it will be to our benefit and to theirs. The thing I might suggest is, one thing you could dangle is, and if you have to work with the legislature on this, the Federal Surface Transportation Act, actually now they call it the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, FAST Act. And if the state comes up with 20% and the local governments, I believe 10, federal government will come in with 70% of the money for upgrades and improvements.
Oh, well, that's a no-brainer. That
Yeah. And what happens is if we can show that whether it's statewide or even just a local regional passenger train, if we can show that there's, you have to build it before you can show it, actually. It's chicken or the egg. But if you can show
understand.
we're going to ride a train, we work with the local regional planning commission, and they actually do this for the federal government. They keep up with road usage and bus usage and all that.
Yeah.
And so they tell the government when it's the federal government, when they can release money to help us do more in terms of our mass transit.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if we can show that we have it, they'll come up with the money. And if you were to say, a lot of these lines are single track, but if you could double the track, my understanding is for the freight companies, their liability insurance goes down.
Well, sure.
Because you
You-
aren't going to
yeah.
be caught up if there's an accident or something goes awry.
Yeah.
Switch people to the other track and keep the freight moving. And
Right.
out people moving.
Yeah.
But
It's an automatic redundancy. So yeah,
Yeah.
that would make sense from a liability standpoint.
but for the people, and I meant to look up and see what poverty is in Arkansas now. I know before the pandemic, it was generally about 44%.
Right.
And even in Northwest Arkansas, which is probably the richest part of the state, it was 22%.
Yeah.
Before the pandemic. And many more people, hundreds of thousands, I'm sure, are even in poverty now, more. And so I think the importance of this, though, if I may suggest this, is if you look at the construction, even just improving the freight line rail, so we have double tracks, so that we have sliding gates that prevent people from trying to go across the tracks when the train's coming. And I'm a transit driver, so I see people parking on railroad tracks where there are active trains all the time. It drives me insane. I might need medication. No, they need to learn not to sit, but we also need those sliding.
Actual barriers. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an actual barrier. It comes like
Yeah.
that, and it will prevent people from trying to drive around.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the floodgates down for the levees in New Orleans where you've got a physical barrier. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's lots of things like that. And actually just looking around the state too, we have a lot of train stations. And to use an example, I believe in Newport, they only have like 1,200 people that live there, but they have a nice little train station set up. The people there apparently only make, on average, less than $9,000 a year. So if you could increase train traffic through there,
Right.
And you had passengers that could board at Newport, you would naturally increase, the amount of what am I thinking of? Well, I'm just thinking passengers would increase business. You'd have
Right. You bring people in, you have more business opportunity, as well as enabling the residents of Newport to transport somewhere else for a better job. It's both directions. Yeah.
Right. And I'm glad you said that about well, now I forgot, but I'll get back to it anyway. So in addition to increasing, though, the business opportunities, small business, things like that, these are major construction jobs. Building new rail, if you want to build a dedicated high-speed rail between Little Rock and Northwest Arkansas, That's going to be about 150 miles. So
Yep.
it's less than the Texas Central, but that's substantial a bit of work you're going to be doing.
Yeah.
Welders on these construction jobs make $60,000 a year. You're going to need a lot of electricians, especially if you're going to use overhead wires, over cantilever
Mhm.
wires or whatever, for the electricity for the high-speed train. They make 80,000 a year. Guys who do the construction management on site make over 100,000.
So
And
I know.
in Texas, they're looking at about 17,000 workers to build that. If we just were conservative, said 10,000,
Mhm.
and tried to encourage the companies to hire as many Arkansas people as possible.
Oh yeah.
I, that's just fantastic. That would be a fantastic boon for our
So
state.
so the reason I'm kind of chuckling about that is not deriding it in any way.
Yeah.
I had an interview with UCA Channel 6 News just on Thursday. They're editing it. They haven't aired it yet. And the reason I'm laughing is because they asked, of course, like with the Keystone Pipeline, one of the questions they said, if something like this came to Arkansas, would you oppose it? And I'm like, yes, absolutely. We've already had the disaster in Mayflower. We saw having to clean that up. We've seen what would happen. And I'm like, plus we're talking about basically doing a pipeline like that and talking about the job loss. Well, you're talking about like the loss of seasonal help at Walmart. They're not permanent sustainable jobs. That's just not it. And I pointed out that when you've got skilled tradesmen like laying concrete, welding, electricians, all of these things that you have to be skilled in, I don't think they particularly care whether they're welding on a pipeline versus welding on high-speed rail infrastructure or doing something. They want the sustainable job. They're not picky about what it's actually being done for. So let's make
Right.
better decisions. So that's a discussion I had literally 2 days ago. So I am 100% on board with that.
Well, we keep being told that we don't have the population density to do some of these things.
Right.
But, we don't have the population density to have the Northwest Arkansas Regional Airport either.
Right.
And that is actually doing very well. Um, the, I mean, the rumor is Walmart wanted it. I hesitated to say that. I don't want to sound like I'm deriding Walmart, but good for them for insisting.
Yeah.
And, so the economic benefits will spread out, and it may not be permanent, but I think it's years of work, because the high speed
absolutely.
rail will take a couple of years at least.
Yeah.
And then you're going to want to double some of these tracks, like I said. So this is kind of a long-term project for just building things up. And as it does, it reduces costs, like you said, and it creates business opportunity. So,
well, and like you're talking about, with if you're using the argument of the population density not justifying the expense, well, the problem is if we don't actually invest in the areas, that density is only going to go down, because we're going to continue losing people to other states where there are better opportunities. So the one problem feeds the other. We have to actually reinvest and give them a reason to stay, and give them the economic support, educational support, everything else, to increase that population density, to make it the kind of place that people want to stay, instead of the kind of place where people are stuck because they don't have the money to go anywhere else, or that they have to flee because they can't get paid for their skill set. So yeah, I think that's something that those two are hand in hand. You have to actually address one to address the other. And like I said, chalking it up to the density problem is feeding that problem. So.
right. Speaking of all these additional jobs, I was looking at CascadiaRail.com.
Okay.
And that's a similar high-speed rail project that they want to build in the northwest part of the United States, and runs from Eugene, Oregon, up through Portland, and then to Seattle, Washington, then to Vancouver, British Columbia. And it's very enlightening, because they're looking at costs. They said, From that, I discovered that actually building railroads are in fact cheaper than building onto highways. You spend less money doing that. And you're also creating a ticketed service.
Mhm.
So you'll get your money back faster than you will on a highway, which, unless you have a toll road,
Toll
is
road. Yeah.
essentially free. And toll roads are a pain in the rear.
Yeah.
But they estimate that it will either create or support 4.2 jobs with the building of the Cascadia Rail.
A 4.2.
Additional jobs. So if you
Oh,
have,
okay. Okay. Okay.
some guy right now is sitting at home and he's an electrician and he can't get any work. And then you call him up and say, well, we need to get this going right now. And he's,
Yeah. I
putting
tell you,
stuff
when
together.
I was making sure the 4.2 wasn't like a 4.2 million or a 4.2 thousand or
Per job.
4.2 ratio. Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, I'm sorry. I should have specified that.
No, it's all right.
So he goes to work and it supports that. But given the level of poverty in this state, I mean, what do you see? Would that be accurate here, or would there be more jobs created potentially, or less, or what do you think?
I think it's going to depend on where we look at the implementation, just because one of the other things that we have to look at that's a big difference between here versus, say, the Northwest Pacific Corridor or Pacific Northwest Corridor, rather, is it does go back down to population density. If we target the areas that are medium density, so that everybody in Arkansas that's in a smaller community already is used to the notion of having to travel to a larger one just inherently. That's part of it. If we make that more accessible for them, then I think we increase economic opportunity for them. And it's on recording, but I don't mind anybody can hear this. I am 100% opposed to the trickle down economics notion that has never worked. You have to bring from the bottom up. So if we implement plans that reach out to the poorest to give them more opportunity to improve their situation, that feeds back into the system and helps everyone along the way. So, you then have, if they need to get back and forth to take care of the job, the groceries, the whatever, they don't have to worry about whether or not their car's broken down and now they've got to spend the weekend fixing it or whatever. You can go. It's fine. You've got something that's on a relatively cheap ticket and you can get what you need and everything. You've got the sick family member. You can get to them. You can make that trip. You can get over there. The stuff that kind of resonates with the small town mentality. And I kind of go back to it. It's something you touched on before, where you were talking about the rails really shifting over away from passenger in the 50s and 60s. And I can't imagine that not being tied to the consumerism post World War II and the coming of age, where it was sudden massive economic freedom, cars being affordable. So it was that sense of independence that fed into, oh, I want to travel on my time schedule, not on a train time schedule. And okay, we've had that segment of generational ideology and everything. Well, now we're kind of moving back into, well, let's worry more about a communal and, let's figure out what's better for everyone instead of ragingly, I got to do it on my own. And kind of strike that balance, because you do still have that fiercely independent mindset that drives the small town, the rural communities. That's why they're there, is they want to be on their own. But we've got to have a way to reach out to them so that they have access to the same things. They don't. It's not a forcing. Again, it's the difference in encouraging versus coercion. That's the ones I always try to remember. Is you can encourage, but coercing is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
But simply providing them the opportunities, I think, is going to be beneficial in the long run. In the end of it, it's whether or not they avail themselves of the opportunities you provide them with. But it's hard to ignore it when it does start being a part of your life. And also, like you said, this isn't something where we're saying like, okay, so we're going to implement this in 2022 and by 2023 it's up and ready. This is going to be a long term. This is something we would be initiating so that our children, grandchildren, etc., are going to benefit from. We may never actually fruition of it, but we're at least laying the groundwork for them to continue building on and working towards.
Right. I agree. And, really, you're just giving people choices. That's what
Exactly.
you're saying. If you are thrifty and you don't want to spend all your time, or even if you just don't want to spend all your time in traffic jams, but you want to go see the Kansas City Chiefs
Exactly.
or the
Yeah.
Royals. I love baseball. I would love to go see a professional baseball game. Um, it'd be great to get on a train in Fayetteville and just travel up there, just relax and
Yep.
uh, maybe look at highlights from the last couple of games and then get to the big Amtrak station in Kansas City and get a bus and go to the stadium and just have a good
Yeah.
time. And
Well, and as loath as I am to bring the corporate ideology back into it, but you do then run into, so how are you monetizing? How are you paying for it and everything else? Well, if you've got this going on, you probably will have Wi-Fi availability on there, much like you do on commercial airlines. You'll
oh yeah,
have advertising time. You will have other ways of monetizing to help support the system and cover it that way, so that you can keep it controlled by the state, but that now we're going to monetize it in different ways. Corporations can still be involved and all that, but it does make it affordable for the citizens so that we're not going to worry about it.
right, right. Well, people don't realize it, but Amtrak does cover its operating expenses with ticket sales
Okay.
when it's not a pandemic. Right now, it's hard to
Granted.
do,
Yeah.
but yeah, they and a statewide system could too.
Yeah.
And of course, we would be part of Amtrak. North Carolina always surprises me because they have a statewide system and it's supported by both Democratic and Republican politicians. So regardless of who's in charge,
Mhm.
they always have funding for the statewide rail. And it goes
Okay.
back to what I was saying before about, you know, you maintain the tracks a little better and you actually help to decrease some cost for the freight lines. So that's why Republicans are really big on it. And the population just actually likes it. According to our regional planning commission up here, the one type of transportation besides airlines, and they're public transport too,
Mhm.
but the one type that is actually gaining in popularity is more or less long distance train travel.
Oh yeah.
So there are fewer people riding buses and maybe fewer people on, this is before the pandemic, fewer people on light rail. But if you were going to go somewhere, if you wanted to go from, like I say, uh, West Memphis to Little Rock, that would be a popular trip because people just enjoy going by train. And
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, aside from the fact that that's one of the most boring drives in the
yeah,
world, but no, I mean, I know that when my wife, of course, again, pre-pandemic, whenever we would have some kind of trip in mind, it would be, okay, all options on the table. Let's look at, when can a train do it? When can a plane do it? What would work with our schedule? What's the best way to take care of this? And there's been a lot of times where if there was more rail availability, that would have been the option. So yeah, um, no, like I said, just in general, I'm in favor of it for multiple reasons. You're just informing me of a lot that I haven't had time to educate myself on, so I appreciate it.
yeah.
So
Well, happy to help any way I can. There's so many things we could talk about. One thing I don't talk about in the group is where does the electricity come from?
right,
People often make fun of this because, well, if you're going to have an electric train with, overhead wires or batteries or whatever, you're going to have to use the coal power plant. And I'm like, actually, electric motors are so much more efficient than
right,
diesel. You will always burn less coal than you would have diesel, and we don't have to rely on the coal-fired power plant.
no,
And I mentioned this to my state senator, Greg Leding,
mhm,
and I need to write a proposal to him and my state representative. But I would like to see an initiative for small or family, I'll say this, family owned ranches and farms to be able to generate extra green energy. So,
Oh,
and right now in Arkansas, we're kind of constrained. I was surprised. I would think everybody loved freedom or something here, but they don't apparently. But you know, you can only put so many solar panels on your house if you own a house.
yep.
So, but allow family farmers to put as many panels up as they want. If they have a bunch of chicken coops, line the tops with solar
Yeah.
and let them sell the energy, um, you know, to anybody. Well, to the, I guess, the energy company, but you can even try to get them to sell it directly to, say, a school district that has battery electric buses.
Right.
They could buy their energy from that farmer,
Yeah.
and
Keep it
that,
on a local municipal level. And
yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
or they could, if we had a statewide rail system that used hydrogen fuel cells. One
Hmm.
of the ways to get hydrogen, of course, is electrolysis. So,
Right.
and that's, they call that green hydrogen. And
Yeah.
so, you know, you could do that, and it would just, it would help farmers and, of course, help us too. And that would just
Right.
one of my suggestions. If we could do that in this state, it would be great.
I know that the one area we'd get pushback, and not to say that it's a no, it's just seeing the fight that we'd have ahead of us, is I remember running into this stipulation at one point. It was that at least with Entergy Arkansas, there's a stipulation that even if you generate more power than you use, you cannot sell it back to them. They just, it doesn't happen. There's no credit system or anything. But I didn't realize that outside of, like, of course, I'm in Little Rock, so a lot of it, that's what I know on it. I didn't realize that they had a stipulation on how many you could put on your own private land. That does seem really counterintuitive given everything. Yeah, that seems odd. So
It is very hard.
um, I would have, I am seriously going to be interested in digging down that rabbit hole and finding out how that one came to be. That's going to be an interesting research for me now.
Well, you know, when you get a big challenge, is going to be to get corporate money out of politics, which is a little bit off
Oh,
topic, but it's relevant to everything. Anything you want to do,
hmm,
got to consider who's funding, you know, the opposition or the opposite idea.
right.
So there's still a lot of dedication to the fossil fuel industry, and I'm sure
Sure.
is where a lot of the opposition to solar and wind and everything comes from. Um, although there are some environmentalists who don't like it either because of the way you make solar panels and some other things.
Right.
It gets to be a mess, and that's why I avoid it in the group. we're just we're not going to touch it. But I
Right.
was saying though, if farmers could supply energy somehow, and um, I also read back in the 70s, enough Arkansas farms and ranches have a stream flowing through them
Hmm.
that if it had enough water, you could, and flowing per minute and all that stuff,
Right.
you could actually build a miniature hydroelectric dam.
Yeah.
And they had figured it out back in the 70s how much you would have to generate to pay for the dam. And of course, you're supplying electricity for your own place.
Hmm.
But I mean, you know, the farmer or rancher could end up with a substantial extra income from that.
Right.
And that would be a big part of this too, regardless of the energy source they use.
Right. Um, no. Well, and I go back to with my grandfather again down in Louisville. He actually grew up down there on a farm. That was the family farm, and five brothers. There was 2,500 acres. He ended up with 500 of them. You know, just as it went down the family.
Wow.
Well, and you're talking about as you know, trying to do hydroelectric and that kind of stuff. And I remember over time there being a creek that ran steadily, and us watching over time as it just dried up as the land changed and all. Um, And of course, unfortunately, when he passed away, they sold the land off rather than do anything, which I was hurt because I was really, really pushing at the time. I'm like, all right, the part that we didn't plant up in hardwood for erosion control would be fabulous solar farms. Why are we not on this? But such is life, it already went away. No, I that's one of the things that, like I said, a lot of the people, I'm going to have to get the word out, and I just haven't had the chance yet, is understanding I do have a solid rural background as well as being in an urban center. So I 100% agree that the farmers, the small independents, if you're trying to live an independent life, we should be helping so that that should be a zero carbon footprint. That should be helping subsidize how you're being paid for. You should be able to do those things. There shouldn't be a hindrance to it. And I know that we've got a couple of larger petrochemical companies in the state that are, you know, big wigs when it comes into the political arena. So I know there's going to be some negotiating there. But I think, I should say I hope that at the federal level, since we've got the push and the initiatives there, I would hope that with a little bit of encouragement, again, you can nudge them in the direction of, well, maybe you should be shifting your business practices over to cleaner energy and away from this. And we should be doing this as a partnership rather than fighting back and forth about who's maintaining a monopoly on something, and try to get back to that idea of cooperative instead of competitive and predatory practices.
Right, right. I agree. Once again, it's using positive reinforcement or making it rewarding to do something. And another thing I was really surprised about, and this is related because um, people wonder about lithium and how you're going to get it.
Right.
No surprise, Arkansas actually has lithium deposits,
Mm-hmm.
and you found it. Well, the way we found it was in southern Arkansas. Uh, they're using the steam method to frack and get oil and gas wells going again. And there's a briny water that is kind of the residue. And as they went through that, they found lithium salt in it.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, I mean, apparently you can filter it out and you've got a supply of lithium, however much there is. Apparently it's very valuable stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And so
incredibly.
we could maybe work with the companies, oil and chemical companies, on how to extract it. And
Um, on a chemical basis, it is going to come down to, because of course, if you get the lithium salts, you have to find out what else there is. So you still have to refine that out of, to
yeah,
get it in the form you need. So it would have to be a cost analysis on that. But like you're saying, it's not like lithium's getting less, valuable.
yeah,
So there should be the incentive there to look into this. Um, I don't have enough chemistry background to just off the top of my head know the process, but I do know the
oh,
basics of how you would go about this. So,
yeah,
no, I knew that we were. I knew that we were a state that was mineral rich. There's the word I'm looking for. I knew that our natural resources extend to that realm too. Finding out that we've actually got an in-house source of lithium like that, we would need to explore and see, okay, so how much and what would it cost to actually utilize and get that going? So that's really good to know.
well, I just have to say I really am encouraged to hear you talk about that because you're being inquisitive and interested in how this works. And I'm really afraid we're going to continue with leaders who could actually kind of care less, as long as they're getting their fat check to go out and say whatever they're told to say.
Right.
So it's a nationwide thing to get money out of politics. You can't just do it here, but maybe we could find a way to make it happen in Arkansas a little bit more. I don't know how you would do it. Maybe some sort of uh, act or law that doesn't let people get money under the table or dark money or.
At the bare minimum, at the bare minimum, addressing Citizens United and getting corporate money out of it, and then the campaign finance reform to where everybody has to report where everything's coming from. But again, that is part of a larger national discussion and ethical issue overall.
Yeah.
And if the only thing I can do is stand there and stick my flag in the ground and go, all right, here's where I am, and that's it, then that's where we're going to start. That's
Yeah.
that was one of the things. It was so odd, and again, kind of jumping topics. But when I first announced, I said, small business owner and all this, and I got a bunch of heat from people going, well, what business? What do you mean? Why? What are you trying to hide? And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm not trying to hide anything. I don't want my campaign to look like I'm trying to generate business. Like here's the info. We're this, but
Yeah.
I have no way of monetizing this. Judge each one on its own merits. It's fine. So it's been interesting as a newcomer to politics, the immediate suspicion that everybody's got, and having to address them one at a time and go, whoa, no, like we can talk, it's fine. That's not where I'm coming from. I completely understand why you have that reaction. I grew up in Louisiana during the Edwin Edwards era. I really understand being suspicious of your politicians, and 100% think we need to hold them accountable. But yeah, we got to find somewhere to start having the conversation as a whole. So
Right. Well, we're almost at the end of our hour. Do you have anything else to say about mass transit or rail? We haven't really talked about buses or anything, but that's actually kind of goes in with rail as I've looked at it.
Right. Now that's I guess just if I can just summarize kind of at least where I'm coming from for you and for the other members of the group or anybody else that's interested. I do think that they're all interlinked. I think it is going to be a matter of, okay, so do we look at how do we address the statewide? How do we get everybody connected? How do we implement at the smaller scale, within the cities, like we're talking about with the electric buses coming to and from the tram stations, as it were. How do we get that up and going? Like, are we addressing this all the way down to the electric scooters for rent at that level? Are we going from that all the way up? Where do we go? Where do we start? And I think that's the conversation where we have to have the analysis of where is it going to benefit the most people first. If we can help the most people out of poverty and out of economically disadvantaged situations, then that has to be the most logical start, because if you're helping them, you're building more wealth and you're building more opportunity to help everyone else. That would seem to be the logical course of action. But I'm 100% in favor of, well, let's investigate and see if that pans out. So I'm no economist. That doesn't, I don't know for sure, but I would certainly be in favor of, let's find out.
I would like to find out too. And I'm like you, I want to build from the bottom up.
Right.
If you could get some of our poorest people working, that's kind of the best way to get people out of poverty, is to get them really good paying jobs,
Well,
it relates to vocational training in high school and all kinds of things.
Oh yeah, that's a topic that again I touched on in the interview that hasn't made it out yet, but on the educational side of it, when I'm talking about education reform and reinvestment on my end, everybody thinks, okay, K through 12. No. Job retraining, everything, like all through life. There is no point in life where education shouldn't still be a factor. You can always learn. If you find yourself out of a job, or suddenly your choice of vocation has become redundant or changed in some nature, then we need to help you get the training to find the new thing, to get to the new point. Ideally, I would hope that the corporations would take that step, but as we've seen historically, they'll cut costs rather than actually do that. So we need to look back and make sure people aren't getting left behind in progress. And
Well, it's a great opportunity to work with corporations to say, what do you need? One of the things that they're building into railroads right now is called positive train control.
Mhm.
And you have these NASA-like control rooms where you have dispatchers who are watching the trains on the different tracks.
Sure.
And so with positive train control, the dispatchers can actually take control of trains and keep them from smashing into each other.
Right.
And apparently the companies that do that are very busy, and
They would need to be.
they
That's
would need to be. And but I mean, if you don't have that many workers, I mean, what an opportunity for Arkansas if we had a vocational school
oh yeah.
where we taught how workers how to install positive train control and even how to work with it and how to troubleshoot it, maintain it, and all that. That would be,
See, and that's where I go back into where we're talking about the cooperative with the corporations and everything. Um, if we're incentivizing it for them to implement their training programs within our state college system, our high school system, where you can go ahead and have that training, yeah, that's where we need to be working together. That's where corporate and public need to come together on is if we're going to have this infrastructure, you need to help here. If you want the tax breaks, you need to actually reinvest in the community, not just give dividends to a guy that needs a seventh yacht. That's all
yeah,
there is to it. So,
absolutely, absolutely. Well, you know, one way to put it is we're not, this isn't just government spending. We are
no,
investing or we're putting capital to work in our communities.
right.
So that's the way I would like to
Yeah.
see us phrase it because I think that will appeal to the
Yeah.
most people. That's my opinion, though.
Well, no, that's been, one of mine from the beginning is I've looked at our tax structure and I've looked at how things are going, and it needs tweaking because it's a little bit outdated, but there's nothing that I've seen that indicates a need to increase personal taxes for the average Arkansan. That's just, there's no reason. Um, where we run into it is the waste. We are getting absolutely terrible value for our spending. And we need people who have, like you, me, the average Arkansan, we need people who have had to worry about things at the end of the month and understand, prioritize things a little bit differently. We need to really be getting more value for our spending, not just throwing away money and
Right.
I'm not the free money end of the spectrum kind of thing, but I am very much we need to pay attention to what we're spending money on. So it's crazy because I'm a Democrat and that sounds like Republican coming out of my mouth, or at least like what conservatives used to be.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. What they used to be. I think about that all the time. But anyway, that's a different subject.
right.
I do want to thank you for your time. And just full disclosure, I am going to now reach out to um, other candidates for governor and see if we can get them to talk to us
Oh, please. Yeah.
and see what their ideas are. And I'm going to just report it to the group. That's what I do. We're nonpartisan, and we kind of
Sure.
have to be anyway because we're nonprofit. So, but I'll just let the group know, this is the response I got, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Sure. I can't think of anything that I said here that I wouldn't say in any other forum. So by all means, you full permission to share. I'm James R. Russell. I approve this message, whatever it's going to be.
I'm Richard Billingsley. I approve it too. So,
No, as far as reaching out to the other candidates, you brought that up. I'm not aware of any official on the Democratic side that have declared. I've heard
Yeah.
rumors and buzz. I'm hoping that someone does. I not so much that I necessarily want the challenge, but I think that we need more ideas out there. Everything's better if we actually challenge each other. And and I would hope that you would actually get feedback from the Republican side as well. I would be genuinely interested in seeing what they have to say.
I would like to too. It's I mean, I have my own political views and everything, but the
Yeah.
question I'm faced with is how much do I value clean air?
Mhm.
And we keep increasing the amount of CO2 we're pumping into the atmosphere. And that the atmosphere doesn't care how you vote.
No,
It just,
no,
you know,
not in the least.
so
I
we've got to get something going. And it kind of, I've noticed that Arkansas voters respond to policies rather than parties or personalities.
That's good.
So I think strong policies will win the day in the end.
Okay. Well, speaking of the clean air, that's one of those. That's one thing I'm constantly confused on. Is I know I was taught climate change as a fact in seventh grade. This was just part of the curriculum in science courses. I'm not sure when it came up for debate. Like I don't know when that became contentious, but yeah, it's we've got to address it, and that's public health crisis on top of everything else. So yeah, I'm with you.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to stop recording now. And
Okay.
once again, I do appreciate it. Thank you so much, and
You're,
best of luck in your campaign.
thank you very much. I appreciate you too.